There's a philosophical concept of the zombie, and the zombie is a creature or a person that has all the same computational capabilities and can move and talk and act, but doesn't have the inner experience. So who has the conscious experience and who's a zombie? And then there's the people who are the panpsychists who say, oh, everything does, electrons and potatoes and the planets and so on. And there's essentially a kind of magicalism to that way of thinking. And the magicalism is that there's the computations and the content, but then there's the magic essence of experience, which you can't touch and you can't quite measure. And the work that I do challenges that concept. It's essentially diametrically opposed to that dualistic, magicalist concept of consciousness. Everything you believe to be true, everything, including all the things you believe about yourself, including this claim, this absolute gut level certainty that you have this experience inside of you, essentially the magic essence, your certainty that you have that everything you think you know derives from information in your brain. Otherwise, you can't think it. You can't think it, you can't say it, you can't have the thought if it's not represented, if it's doesn't derive from information. It derives from information in your brain. And the key is those bundles of information, those models are never accurate, ever. They're always sketchy. They're always schematic. That's how brains work. And so when we go around claiming I have this magic experience inside of me, how do we explain how the extra essence appears? The answer is it doesn't. That's just how the brain is describing itself to itself. It's a big brain's a big computing machine, and it's building models of things, including of itself. And this is the essential answer to this whole consciousness mystery. No magic, no dualism. It's computation. Some brains include that kind of self-model, others don't.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 223. And this absolute banger is with Michael Graziano, who is professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University, where he and his lab research the brain basis of consciousness. This is Michael's second appearance on the show. In episode number 169, we covered the philosophical question of what consciousness is and Michael's solution to the problem, which is called the Attention Schema Theory of Consciousness, and in which consciousness is a way in which the brain models attention to better organize and monitor itself. This round, however, has a much more particular or special purpose. If you've been watching the show for the last couple of months or so, you'll be aware that I've been reevaluating my diet because, pretty simply, I'm uncomfortable with causing animals to suffer in order to eat. Thus, I really wanted to better understand the nature of animal consciousness, experience, and suffering with the goal of informing my animal product consumption. So in this conversation, we re-examine the attention schema theory of consciousness with an eye toward the consciousness not only of humans, but of other animals, including crustaceans, fish, octopuses, poultry, cattle, pigs, and more. Michael's most recent book is Rethinking Consciousness, a link to which you will find in the description. Otherwise, reviews, comments, likes, subscriptions, all of these things are, as always, greatly appreciated. There is also a link to the Patreon in the description if you would like ad-free episodes, to ask questions for future AMA episodes, or to have show notes for each episode. And now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Michael. So I have really been looking forward to this conversation, not just because I enjoy talking to you, but because lately consciousness has been at the forefront of my mind, particularly animal consciousness, just because of dietary reasons. I've been evaluating my diet of late, and I want to start with the ground up again, talking about what consciousness is, all of these sort of things. But first, I wanted to ask, I know that consciousness is obviously the specialty of your lab at the moment, but what was it that first got you interested in animal consciousness in particular? Because I know that's something you think a lot about.
Right. I mean, I think that the topic of consciousness has been really interesting to me in general. Humans are animals, so they're just part of the larger biological world. I don't think I've had a particular interest on non-human animal consciousness. I sort of put them all together. The question of the evolution of consciousness is really interesting, and so that gets into all kinds of lineages of animals, and that's just been very interesting to me. So I think that general question in my mind, in terms of my interest, dates back a long time. I mean, a lot of us, before we ever got into neuroscience or psychology, started out with that question. Like, that's part of what gets us into the topic, is this question everyone has. Like, what is this? What is the mind? What is this consciousness thing?
To the extent that you're interested in animal consciousness, it's just minds in general.
Minds in general.
Okay.
I think I'm interested in humans. I'm interested in artificial consciousness. I'm interested in other primates. I'm interested in mammals and birds and the whole thing, and who has it? What does it mean to have it? What are the conditions? What does it even mean to have that property?
When I think of animal consciousness, what I'm interested in, I think boils down maybe to three things. I'm sure that we could get more granular. But I'm interested in that philosophical question, whether it's like, or what it's like to be an animal. Then for purposes of my diet, I'm concerned with whether or not certain animals are capable of suffering. And then I'm interested in this third question that's also more philosophical, and it's about whether or not there is value in itself to being conscious and being alive. But I'm wondering, maybe first of all, if we should just start with what you think of, how you think of consciousness, just quite broadly.
Yeah. So that's the big question. That's a very general question, and obviously different people have different concepts of it. And in particular, the conceptual framework changes all the time, and you go back in scientific history, and you get these really different takes on what consciousness is. And right now, the scholarly world of consciousness tends to focus on one particular way of thinking about it. Consciousness is experience. It's subjective experience. That's what it is. And so in that way of thinking about it, a computer doesn't have it because it computes numbers, but it doesn't have subjective experience according to the way most people think. Maybe an animal does, like the famous Nagel example of the bat. What is it like to be a bat? A bat has subjective experience, but it's experiencing different things than a person would. So the experience of a bat is different from me, and my experience is similar, but still not identical to your experience or some other person's. So in that kind of way of thinking that probably most scholars are focused on right now, consciousness, what is it not? It's not self-knowledge. Consciousness is not, I know that I'm mortal and I'm a person and I have a trajectory and this is my past. That's not what consciousness is. Those are some of the things that are in consciousness. Like, you can have those thoughts and you can experience thinking those things. You can also experience the color green when you look at the lawn, or you can experience a poke on your arm. So you can be conscious of all kinds of different things. You can be conscious of making a decision or conscious of an emotion, but that's the content of consciousness. There's something separate, a separate issue, which is how do you have a subjective experience of anything at all? What's the essentially magic that makes you have a subjective experience? So that's the kind of definition of consciousness that most scholars are focusing on right now in the field of consciousness studies. So who has that, right? Or to put it in another way, there's a philosophical concept of the zombie, and the zombie is a creature or a person that has all the same computational capabilities and can move and talk and act, but doesn't have the inner experience. So who has the conscious experience and who's a zombie? And that's, in a sense, kind of the current groundwork in the field, the way people tend to think about it. And then people have arguments, well, is it just people? Is it just me? And maybe other people don't have it. Or is it humans but not other primates? Is it primates but not other animals? Where do we draw the line? Do bacteria have experience? Do plants have experience? And then there's the people who are the panpsychists who say, oh, everything does, electrons and potatoes and the planets and so on. All right. So this is the kind of general way that people are thinking. And and there's essentially a kind of magicalism to that way of thinking. And the magicalism is that there's the computations and the content, but then there's the magic essence of experience, which you can't touch and you can't quite measure. And you can't push on it and measure a reaction force. So it doesn't have any physical substance to it. It just is. It's the non-physical experiential component itself, right? And so this is fundamentally what's called a dualistic approach, dualistic thinking, that there's a physical world, but then there's this other essence, the consciousness essence, and who has it and who doesn't. And so that permeates the field. Almost every theory of consciousness out there is built on that kind of premise. And the work that I do challenges that concept. It's essentially diametrically opposed to that dualistic, magicalist concept of consciousness. So everything I do is predicated on a different concept altogether. And the concept is that, to put it really as succinctly as I can, everything you believe to be true, everything, including all the things you believe about yourself, including this claim, this absolute gut level certainty that you have this experience inside of you, essentially the magic essence, your certainty that you have that everything you think you know derives from information in your brain. Otherwise, you can't think it. You can't think it. You can't say it. You can't have the thought if it's not represented. If it's doesn't derive from information. It derives from information in your brain. The brain builds what are called models, bundles of information that depict things, depict itself, depict the world, depict your body, and so on. And the key is those bundles of information, those models are never accurate, ever. They're always sketchy. They're always schematic. That's how brains work. And so whatever certainty we think we have about ourselves, it's not accurate. It's always inaccurate. It's always a blurry, sketchy kind of thing, right? This is why, it took Newton to figure out that the color white is actually a mixture of lots of colors and not like a purified luminance without any contaminants, because the brain's model of colors is wrong. It's simplified, it's useful, it's just not accurate. And so when we go around claiming I have this magic experience inside of me, how do we explain how the extra essence appears? The answer is it doesn't. That's just how the brain is describing itself to itself. And don't take that literally. Don't take its self-description literally, because it's not accurate. It's a self-model. It's a self-description. And a self-model is not magic. It's just a matter of computation. It's a big brain's a big computing machine, and it's building models of things, including of itself. And this is the essential answer to this whole consciousness mystery. No magic, no dualism. It's computation. Some brains include that kind of self-model, others don't. And now we can ask which ones do, which ones don't, and what's the usefulness of it? Like, why would that have evolved? Those are other questions that we can ask. But that's the essential framework, the essential answer that I work within. So it's absolutely the opposite of what most of the field is studying right now.
Okay, there's a lot there, a lot of tons of interest, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on at least some of those things in more detail. But for now, I would like to focus on your very rough definition of consciousness as experience. And you said that we know that, or we believe that bats have experience, they just experience different things from us.
And what I wonder, I mean, certainly they don't see, so they're not experiencing sight. But I think there's also a question of whether their experience is just of a completely different kind. It's not just of different things per se. But you and I, or let's say, I don't know with 100% certainty that you have experience, but I feel quite justified in asserting that you do, because I see you as very much like me. We know that our brains work in very similar ways. But what I'd like to start with is how we might know that certain animals are conscious and having experience, and what the methodology for this might be. Because I've been doing research trying to figure out, are scallops conscious? Are shrimp conscious? And so on. So I'm curious about the general methodology.
So in the field in general, which, as I said, is suffused with magical thinking, there's no answer and there's no methodology that anyone can come up with.
When you say the field is suffused with this magical thinking, are you referring to neuroscience and philosophy, or within neuroscience as well, there's magical thinking?
Every theory out there, with the exception of one or two, is fundamentally dualist and magical.
Okay, I did not realize that it was this pervasive in neuroscience as well. I thought that was more a philosophical thing.
No, everyone is asking the question you just asked. What animals have the magic essence of experience, right? And the answer is none of them, including us, including you, including me. We don't have that magic essence. We have computational machinery that's building self-descriptive models. And so we think we have all these properties, and they're not accurate descriptions of ourselves. They're useful, they're just not accurate. That's the key, that's the heart of it all. That there's a little bit of logic, as I said, there's a little piece of logic that in the end one has to accept that everything you think is true about yourself derives from information in your brain, and the information is never accurate. And this is true. This is always true, unfortunately. This is always true. Okay. And so, no, I don't have a magic essence inside of me. I'm certain at some level that I do, because that's what, every time my cognition accesses deeper models, that's what those deeper models say. That's what they tell my higher cognition. You have this, you have this. It's essentially circular, right? The heart of the philosophy of consciousness, the central tenet, so to speak, is I know I'm conscious. I know I have conscious experience because I'm experiencing it right now. Think about how circular that is. It's essentially the statement, it's true because it's true. I know I'm experiencing because I'm experiencing. You know, what is that? That's a machine stuck in a logic loop. That's a machine accessing its own internal self-descriptions and getting the information and then saying, oh, I guess that's true, and then spewing that out, right? And so the questions facing us as scientists is, what brains construct that kind of self-model, and why? What good is it? It turns out it's actually really useful to have self-models, because it's really useful to be able to predict your own behavior and to think of yourself as an entity in amongst other entities. It's very useful for survival, right? So what creatures have that kind of self-model and what creatures don't? We're not 100% sure of the answer to that, right? But at least it's an approachable answer. It's no longer that you need some kind of magic meter that can measure the consciousness waves coming out of something. It's not a magic essence. Instead, it's, can we understand the computations going on inside the neural machinery and figure out what it's computing about itself, right? It becomes something that's at least in principle testable. And probably, given the kind of research I'm doing in my lab, the view or theoretical structure that we're building up, we suspect probably the thing we refer to as consciousness, the kind of self-model we have, emerges quite a long time ago in evolution, but is probably present, first of all, in mostly vertebrates. It's probably present in some reptiles and in birds and mammals. It's probably that main group of animals. There's nothing that exists without a brain. Plants don't have it. Bacteria don't have it. It's possible that other evolutionary branches independently evolve it. because a lot of the same algorithms and computational needs crop up in different kinds of circumstances. And so people have argued that octopuses are conscious, and that may be. They have a need for a lot of the same skill set. Octopuses are these intensely visual predatory animals, and so they need a lot of the same visual attention and, visual control of movement and so on. And they may well have evolved similar mechanisms, so it's possible. But I would say our version of it, at least, probably evolved before the split, right before the split between the lineage that eventually led to birds and the lineage that eventually led to humans. And so we're talking maybe, 300 million years ago, somewhere in that time frame, with essentially reptiles or some subpart of reptilia. And then it branches out, and it's something like is probably present in essentially all mammals and essentially all birds. That would be my guess, given our theoretical structures that we're building.
You used the word attention in connection to octopuses, and in our last conversation, which was about a year ago, we talked about the attention model, but I don't want to assume that our listeners have already heard that episode, so let me just ask what the connection is between attention and self-modeling is, and how vital attention is to your theory of consciousness.
Right. So attention is, in a sense, the most important property of a brain. And people tend to sort of skip over it because we have a very colloquial notion of what attention is. I pay attention to you and I'm ignoring someone else, and that's great, and so what? I mean, sure, people pay attention and it's part of everyday life. But here's what attention does. Attention is a way of using resources in a strategic way. And so without attention, if you had to process everything equally, then just to have any intelligent reaction to anything, you would need a brain the size of a planet. The loss of efficiency would be incredible. You can't process everything equally in great depth and come up with intelligent connections, integrations, and strategies for everything. So you got to have attention. You got to have a way of winnowing things down, figuring out what's the most important items of the moment and what's the most important ways of thinking about it at the moment. That's what attention is. It's deep selective processing, and it is the reason why we're intelligent with, brains the size that we have. It's the only reason why we have any intelligence at all. So that's attention, is this incredibly important data handling method that evolved. And the particular kind of attention that I'm most interested in evolved in the cortex, the cerebral cortex. So it's a very special cortical style attention. And you see it in animals with cortex. You see it in animals with homologs of the cortex. So birds have a brain structure which is evolutionarily derived from the same underlying structure. In birds, it's called the wulst. In mammals, it turned into the cortex, but it evolved from the same underlying structure. And so this is a key part of the work that we do, of the theory that we're building. So that's what attention is. Now, in addition to having attention, the brain also builds essentially a concept of what attention is. So it's not just using it. It also knows it's using it, and it has some concept of what it's doing. And that concept, like I have said already, the brain's models are always inaccurate. They're useful, they're schematic, they're simplified. And it's that bundle of information, that self-description, that we think leads people to start saying, well, I have this inner essence, this experiential component. And what they're really doing is giving a schematic, somewhat detail-poor account of attention. So you're looking for animals that have this really sophisticated cortical style attention and this internal descriptive and predictive model of attention. And those are going to be, they're going to be mammals and birds mostly.
Before we talk about other animals, maybe we should just start with humans. And what I'm curious about here is methodologically how you're testing your theory of consciousness and what sort of data you're looking at in humans, whether it's behavioral or brain scans and so on, to develop this model.
Right. So the key to the whole theory is called the attention schema theory. It's been around for a while now.
Sorry, I called it the attention model. Attention schema.
It's very similar. Attention schema theory. And it's been around for, 15 years now, maybe. And data and other work has been accumulating on it, and many labs have also been working on it.
But you introduced it.
Yes, that's right. So this was, and we're still the main lab working on it. And so the heart of the theory is essentially that there is this thing called attention, and that's been studied for the last 100 years, and people have increasingly good sense of what attention is, selective attention. But there's also the brain's schematic model of it. And this is the heart of the theory. That's why it's called attention schema theory, because there's an attention schema. And having an attention schema is useful. That's essentially the theory. It says the brain builds this thing, this model, because it's useful, and it's useful in this way, and it's useful in that way. And so a lot of the data is, well, do we build an attention schema? And under what circumstances does it come in handy cognitively, right? So there are lots and lots of ways to show that people have a model of attention, predictive model of attention. And what are some good examples? So a magician in front of a crowd understands the attention of the crowd and uses misdirection to get people to attend here while this thing is going on there. And the magician has an intuitive understanding of how human attention moves and can predict it. And not just, I know he's going to attend to that, but also the magician knows what that means. Like, because he's attending to that, therefore, he's not going to even know about this. He's going to react in a certain specific way. So I can predict his behavior. I can predict his emotions. I can predict his thinking, because I understand how those things relate to attention. And I understand how to predict attention so well I can manipulate it. None of that's possible unless that magician's brain has in it a kind of little predictive model of what attention is and how it works, right? That's not just a machine that uses attention. It's a machine that understands it and has an ability to predict it. That's an attention schema. And that kind of thing can be tested. It can be tested behaviorally. There are lots of paradigms we can use to show that people build these models or this understanding of what attention is, what their own attention is, what other people's attention is.
If a creature can model the attention of another creature, so it has, I don't know if you want to call it like a second order attention schema, would you be more inclined to conclude that that creature has a first order attention schema and thus might be worthy of being called conscious?
Yeah. So there's a question, which came first? Is it the social ability to understand the attention of other creatures? Or is it an ability to model and understand one's own attention? And there are people who argue that. The theory, AST, attention schema theory, is actually agnostic on that one. I mean, whichever came first. My own opinion is probably one's own models come first. They're just enormously useful. So the idea of building a model of something is it makes it easier to control it. So the brain builds a model of your arm. It's called the arm schema. And that's just a little model in there that's like a simulated arm that tells you what your arm is doing and what it's likely to do in the future. And when that model gets damaged, you have terrible trouble controlling your arm. So the model, these schemas or models are really important in control. And attention is something we have to control. Like we move our attention around the world in very precisely controlled ways. I don't think we'd be able to do that without an ability to monitor and predict our own attention. So I think one's own attention model comes first. And it's only much later in evolution that it expands and turns into the social model, and we start applying it to other creatures. That's my guess. Other people can have different guesses. But I'm guessing that that's what happens, that your self model starts first. Yeah.
What I had in mind in asking that question is, a number of years ago, I was very interested in folk psychology, so I was reading a lot of papers about folk theory of mind, and I was reading some of the studies that Simon Baron-Cohen had conducted on people with autism, and this got me down a rabbit hole where I was reading about studies where researchers were trying to determine whether or not chimpanzees had theories of other minds, and it seems that they do, perhaps, obviously not to the same degree that we have.
Yeah. So theory of mind is tricky. Yeah. There's a classic test of theory of mind, which is the false belief test that people have used for a long time. And the false belief test, basically, the idea, so the classic false belief test, you have two boxes. You tell somebody a story. Here's the story. There's Sally and there's Anne, and they're in front of two picnic baskets. And Anne puts her sandwich in basket A, and the basket's closed. And then Anne goes to the bathroom. And Sally, who's a devious little jerk, takes the sandwich out of basket A and puts it in basket B, and then closes the tops. Anne comes back. Where will she look for her sandwich first? And most adults will say, she thought it was in box A. That's where she put it. That's where she's going to look. But most little kids say she's going to look in basket B because that's where it is. Because they don't yet have a fully developed concept that Anne has a mind, and that Anne's mind contains information that happens to be false. And so she's going to act on that information. So it takes a certain amount of sophistication to understand that another creature has a mind of its own and acts on that information. And so then people began to ask, okay, at what point do humans develop theory of mind? And what other animals have theory of mind as measured by this test? But it turns out the test is incredibly stringent, probably over stringent. So young children, for one thing, have trouble understanding the language and the words. And so you have to figure out ways of asking the question really simply. And then you find out that younger and younger children pass the test, younger than people had previously thought, because just the framing of the question was too complicated. And then you try to go to other animals, and it turns out it isn't so much that they don't understand about other minds. It's just that the test is this really complicated shell game. It's like asking them to do calculus or something. Mm-hmm. Like they can't keep track of the boxes and this and the that. But probably a huge range of other animals have the ability to understand something about the mind states of each other. And so even though, chimpanzees and some crows and maybe an animal here or there passes the false belief test, and then people get very excited and say, oh, they have theory of mind. Probably a much huger range of animals has the essential components of theory of mind. They can look at someone like there's a wonderful study with dogs where when dogs play, one dog waggles its tail and jumps around and gets the other dog to play. But if the one dog is not looking, like dog A wants to play with dog B and dog B is not looking, dog A knows that. Dog A is essentially thinking, well, I get dog B's perspective in mind. He's not looking at me. I got to do something else. And then dog A is more likely to bark to attract attention. Then when dog B looks, then dog A can start jumping and playing. And so they understand each other's perspectives to some extent. They understand they have separate minds and that you have to attract attention and what attention is in the other animal and so on. Even though dogs, as far as I know, fail the false belief task. So theory of mind in the most general sense is probably present in a huge range of animals. Again, it wouldn't surprise me if it was basically mammals and birds.
Pretense or play is obviously another very big field of research and connected to theory of mind. So I'm remembering also reading studies where you would have children and somebody picks up a banana and uses it as a cell phone, and you need to have a theory of mind for a child to recognize that it's a cell phone and not just a banana. And it kind of reminds me of this idea with the dogs playing. But so what we've been talking about are, second order, maybe attention schemas. And I'm wondering what sort of tests you would run on a human or a dog or a chimpanzee to determine whether or not they have this first order attention schema.
Yeah. So,
well, humans we know, but
right. My research is certainly on humans because it's much easier to do the experiments because you can ask them. Right. And also you can give them instructions as to how to do the experiment. So even if you're just asking them to press buttons and look at lights, it's to train a non-human animal for a year and a half to press the right buttons is a bit costly. To tell a person in 30 seconds, that's easy. So my lab focuses on humans, but in principle, the same things could be done. I think that any creature that has selective attention, and there are tons of creatures that do, and there's vast amounts of research that shows, that birds have attention and mice have attention and dogs have attention, and attention in the sense that they can choose to, or a flashy thing in the environment can pull their attention. And once they attend to something, they process it in depth at the cost of processing other things, right? If you have that, and if you can control it, so there's something called top-down attention. There's like bottom-up attention is the flashy, noisy things in the environment grab your attention. But we're not a slave to that. We have the ability to force our attention on the things that are important to us. That's top-down control of attention. If you have that top-down control, I think on principle, just on the there's principles of what's called control theory. If you can control it, you have a model of it. Because you need a model, you need to predict it, and you need to monitor it in order to control it, whatever it is. So, I think that any animal with top-down control over its own attention has a model of attention, has a very basic, reflexive, built-in, I guess, what you mean by a first-order model of attention. That's what I would guess. I think on principle that's probably has to be true.
So since you're doing most of your studies on humans, would your general methodology for ascertaining whether other animals have consciousness just be trying to identify what the human neural structures are that are connected to the attention schema, and then looking back and saying, okay, the birds have the waltz, which is connected. It's similar to the cortex.
That's part of it. But then you get into animals like octopuses, right, where the evolutionary path is totally different, and they have really different brain structures that are not easily comparable. And you run into the artificial intelligence problem, and that's something that my lab is now working on quite a bit. How can you understand or build these kinds of systems artificially? And then, of course, it doesn't look anything like it. Like the brain structures aren't the same. And so how do you tell? How do you know? And you have to look at it much more at the algorithmic level, and ask what are the capabilities of the agent. And so yes. So I'll give you an example. And this isn't really, it's consciousness adjacent. It's very closely related to all these different questions, but it isn't maybe the heart of what people think of as consciousness. But it turns out in people, one of the ways that we model or understand attention, especially visual attention, is by means of this weird subthreshold tendency to perceive beams coming out of people's eyes. Now, this is really weird. But when you look at someone attending to something, Like there's John and he's paying a lot of attention to whatever, a coffee cup. You may not know it, but your brain is essentially drawing a moving arrow from John's eyes to the coffee cup. And that moving arrow is literally built into your brain. Like your visual motion machinery is generating a motion signal and painting it onto the scene, flowing from John's eyes to the coffee cup. It's one of the ways that we build it's sort of like when you look at, when football commentators draw their arrows on the field to keep track of things in a very schematic way. It's not like the football field actually has arrows on it. It's just a useful way to keep track of what's going on. So our brains do this. Our brains build arrows, draw arrows on the social world to keep track of who's paying attention to what. And we do this, we all do this. And we do this at a very sub-threshold level. It can't be super vivid, otherwise it would interfere with our vision. Like we can't actually literally see things flowing out of the eyes, or it screw up our ability to see the world. So it's very faint. It's very sub-threshold, it's very faint, but it's there. And we can show that. We can show that in a lot of different ways. I mean, one of the easy ways is to put someone in a scanner and show them a picture of John looking at the coffee cup, and sure enough, the visual motion areas light up as though there's something flowing from one to the other, right? That's an easy way to do it. There are other ways to do it. So if you stare long enough at John looking at the coffee cup, then you develop a motion after effect in the in-between area. The motion after effect, like the waterfall effect. You see water flowing one direction, and then you look at something stationary and it looks like it's drifting the other direction. That's a motion adaptation effect. You can generate a motion adaptation effect by looking at other people gazing at things, because our brains are busy drawing these moving arrows on other people, on trying to understand the social world. And so this is weird, but it's convenient. It makes evolutionary sense because it makes it easier to keep track of our social world. And it might explain culturally why there's this huge amount of kind of cultural belief in things like beams coming out of the eyes and evil eyes. And you can feel someone stare poking the back of your neck. You go through culture, it's suffused with this stuff. Like Superman has X-ray vision, but weirdly, it always involves some beams coming out of his eyes. Mm-hmm. Or the old idea of the ancient Greeks of vision by something flowing out of your eyes and touching objects. Like these ideas come naturally to us, partly because we have a system in our brains built in to think of the world in that way, just because it's easy, not because it's accurate, because it's an easy way to model the world. I think it plays into traditional concepts of consciousness as a energy-like essence inside that can flow out of the body at times. I think is part and parcel of that larger set of beliefs. But here's the thing. Now that we know people have this, and we can measure this in people, even though you may not know it, we put you through these experiments, we'll find it in you. We can do that on non-human animals too. We can do the same experiments. We haven't yet, as it happens, and it's something that I think would be really interesting to try. But I am willing to bet that social animals, like monkeys or like dogs, probably, or really social birds, probably have exactly the same mechanism. They're probably all perceiving faint beams coming out of each other's eyes. They're all probably perceiving the mind energy flowing out toward things, right? And so in that sense, they all share at a raw first order level. They all share the same kind of thing that leads to some of our superstitions.
My own experience with my animals tells me that you're spot on, just because my dog in particular is always looking at my eyes. And if I look at the cat, if I look at something on the wall, he doesn't care that much. If I look at the cat, then he has to go get in front of the cat and start pawing at me to make sure that I pay him attention instead of the cat. But I am with you 100% that I am in principle opposed to magical theories of consciousness. So I just want to, I'm saying this to preface that I am not trying to trick you with what I want, with what I am about to ask.
Yeah.
And I don't have magical presuppositions in asking these questions, but I want to return to these 3 reasons that I said I was interested in animal consciousness. And before we talk about how they might relate to animals, I just want to get a baseline by seeing how you would answer them with respect to humans. How do you answer the question, is it like anything to be a human?
Not in the sense that people and philosophers mean. I think that the idea that there exists a what it is like, that idea is itself a simplified self-model, right? It's as accurate, it's the way we depict ourselves, and it's as accurate and true to reality as the I-beams are true to reality. Like, there are no I-beams in reality. The brain constructs, a model and says, well, let's just pretend that's true because it makes life easier. That's what I think is going on with the what it is like component. It just makes it easier for the brain to keep track of itself and its world, to tell itself it has that.
Because being like something is inherently magical. And so the brain can tell itself that there is something magical going on, but it's not. It's just a way of keeping, a simpler way of keeping track of things going on in the brain.
What is it? I mean, essentially the brain is telling it, I mean, if you went through the exercise and imagine a brain says, I'm paying attention to it. I'm paying attention to the red apple. It's really, the red is saturated. I'm paying attention to it means I'm not paying attention to other things. I'm really focusing on that, and I'm processing it in depth, and it kind of overwhelms my processing, and it means that I can understand it and I can choose to react to it and all these great things. But I don't really want to know about the details of attention, because I don't want to know about neurons and how they connect to each other and all the mechanism. So let's throw all the details out, and instead let's depict an essence inside of me that has no physical details. It's just an essence, and it's the essence of vivid experience, and that's a good enough way to depict the fact that I'm paying attention to that red apple. That's what I think is going on. And it's not so much, the benefit of it is not so much that it's magical and the brain can say, I'm magic. It's the benefit is that it's a simple way of the brain saying, I'm paying attention to it, with all the consequent things that allows me to do. But I don't have to worry as a brain. I don't have to worry about all the physical, mechanical details. So I'm essentially therefore telling myself I have a property that lacks physical details. It's free floating. It's magical in that sense. That's what I think is going on. That's what I think subjective experience is. It's like the I-beams. It's a useful way to keep track of yourself.
And the next thing I wanted to ask, and if the spirit moves you, I am happy to get, or I would like to get more technical on this question, is whether or not human beings are capable of suffering, and whatever suffering is, how exactly is it instantiated in the human brain?
So let me start with this. One of the examples I really like, I mentioned it already, is the color white. Because in the real world, the physical world, there's reflectance spectra everywhere, and some of those spectra are uneven and some are much more even. And the very even ones, at least across the visible part of the spectrum, that's what we call white. And that's not how the brain processes it. The brain says there's 3 color channels and a brightness channel. Actually, at some point, the brain recombines and turns it into 4 color channels: yellow, blue, red, and green. And then there's brightness. And when we look at something white, the model the brain constructs is very simple. It says all the color channels are down low and the brightness channel is up high. That's what white is. And of course, that's not what white is physically. It's a totally incoherent description of the color white. Newton is the one who figured that out, and figured out, no, white is a mixture of all wavelengths. So now we, 300 years later, we look at white And we all have this weird fractured way of understanding it because we've all gone to school. So we all know that white is a mixture of all colors. It's not true that it got purified or the contaminants got stripped out of it. We all know that. But that doesn't change the model that our visual system constructs. We're born with it. We can't, it's like we don't have a top-down intellectual way of fixing our visual system, and it wouldn't do us any good anyway, because there's a good reason why the visual system simplifies the world so that we can process it with a limited amount of neural hardware. That's why it's so simple. So we have a reflexive visual model which tells us that white is one thing, pure, clean, uncontaminated. And we have an intellectual model that we learned in school which tells us that white is something else. It's a mixture of all things. It's the muddiest color there is. And we walk around happily with both of those in our head at the same time. And one does not negate the other. They both exist at the same time in our heads. And we have to deal with that. And everyone's okay with it because it's been hundreds of years now that we've been dealing with it. And we all got used to it. That exact same way of thinking is going to have to apply to all aspects of consciousness, right? So you ask, well, do people really experience suffering? And there's this whole intellectual, scientific way of understanding it that says, well, experience isn't really what we think it is, and it's computation and this and that, and this is all true. But no matter how much you understand that intellectually, it does not change the reflexive models. Right? Those are still doing their thing. They're still building their things and pumping information through the rest of our brains. And so if someone takes a needle and stabs you, you're still going to go, hey, that hurt. Stop that. That's awful. I don't want that to happen to me. Like, that's going to happen. And the emotional associations, the emotional processing, and all the emotional circuitry that people really don't understand, that's going to get engaged. So there's a version in which aesthetically people suffer. And there's a version in which intellectually, as we understand the computations, something much more sophisticated and materialistic is going on. So there's a scientific way of understanding it, but then there's the user way of understanding it. So I do not think that understanding it from the scientific perspective negates the user suffering or joy or whatever, right? So do people suffer? Yeah, there's a sense in which people suffer, of course. Pain is there. I think that probably these mechanisms of attention and consciousness that we study, if they get damaged, and they do sometimes in people with stroke damage, sometimes that suffering, you can have a person that no longer feels pain, that no longer suffers. That, there's something, as I've written about many times, called hemispatial neglect, where half of space and half of your body kind of gets wiped from your awareness, and you poke them with the pin, and they might squirm, but they don't really know what happened or why. And the brain is processing the information, but not in that particular way. And so there's validity to the intellectual side that's getting away from the experience and the magicalism, but there's also validity to the user experience, basically. And so, people can suffer. Animals can suffer. Yes.
I have seen my fair share of neuroscience papers, even though I'm not a neuroscientist, and I know that you and your people are very fond of extremely intricate diagrams. And so I'm not going to ask for the extremely detailed picture, but can you give me a rough idea of what happens when the needle jabs into your arm that ends up resulting in something happening in your brain that correlates with or corresponds to the subjective experience of pain and suffering?
So most people who study it are, there are pain nerves.
Nociceptors?
Yes, nociceptors.
Nociceptors.
And there's tons of different kinds. It's the most diverse set of peripheral nerves. Lots of different categories, and there's, temperature, and there's, extreme cold, which is a type of pain, and extreme heat, and then there's sharp pain, which is transmitted through very fast fibers, and there's the sort of dull, throbbing pain transmitted through very slow fibers, and all kinds of other things that people have studied in the periphery. That is not pain. That's the peripheral signaling mechanism. And obviously that's not pain, because if you have all the nerves perfectly intact, but then you sever their connection to the brain, the person doesn't feel any pain, right? That's not the same thing as pain. So then they get into the brain and they make their central connections.
I would just like to point out that you made, to me, a very interesting observation, because I have been pondering over, for instance, whether or not certain types of shrimp feel pain. And yes, they have nociceptors, but they don't have a brain. The type that I'm looking at, they don't have a centralized nervous system, at least. But that just popped into my brain. But please keep going.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I don't think shrimp feel pain. I don't think shrimp feel in the same sense that we understand the word. I don't think they have those same self models that we have. It's possible they have some really simple precursor versions, but I suspect not. But that would be for further study.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the shrimp. I'm sorry for throwing you off the track. But okay, so the pain hits or not the pain, but because there's no pain yet. Needle hits arm, nociceptors send signal up to the neck. If the spinal cord is severed, there's no pain, but suppose it's intact.
Right. So now there's these central connections, and there's tons of them. There's connections for pain. Actually, the first connection is in the spinal cord. There's a secondary neuron, and then that goes up to the brain. The secondary neuron synapses, there's a place in something called the thalamus, where there's another synapse, where the neurons come in and they connect to the third neuron in line. And then the third neuron goes all over the brain and branches out, and there's cortical areas that receive information, right? So all of this is processing information about events on the surface of the skin.
When you say that there's a secondary and then a tertiary neuron, do you literally mean that there is one neuron, or there's a type of neuron and it's actually like 1,000 or 1,000,000 neurons that are getting activated right here and then moving into the
So they're millions, but they're in parallel.
Okay.
So you can literally trace a single neuron, if you wanted to, from your foot all the way up to your spinal cord. Like, that's one really long neuron. It's very, very thin, single cell connecting your foot to your upper spinal cord. And yet there's, of course, millions of those all in parallel with each other. And you activate one of them and you should be able to feel the pain ultimately. But normally you're activating many of them. Yes. So that's the first neuron in line that connects your foot to your or whatever, your arm to your the spinal cord, first relay, so to speak, in the pain sequence. And the second bundle of neurons goes from the spinal cord up into the thalamus, which is this central structure in the brain. The thalamus is serves the cortex. It's this thing like the pit at the heart of the cortical outer covering, and it evolved with the cortex, and it grew massively as the cortex grew. So it's part of that whole machinery. And then the third set of neurons transmits from the thalamus up into the cortex in really rich, complicated ways. And pain branches out all over the place. There's lots and lots of other areas in the brain that process pain. But there is and most people who study pain perception study that. They're studying the representations of it. They're studying how the information is represented and coded. That is not the same thing as subjective experience, which is that's a component that you typically don't find in studies of pain, right? Those are much more anchored to the nuts and bolts. But you do have this final layer, which is the subjective experience itself. And so, in theory, it's possible to have all those mechanisms in operation, active, crackling away, firing away, and yet not have that final subjective experience component active, and then you don't feel pain. then you're like the proverbial zombie. The machinery is there, but the experiential component is missing. But I would say what's missing is the final stage of self-models that allows you to say, I am a person and I'm feeling this right now, and I don't like it, right? That final stage of self-model could be missing. So that's what I think is involved. There's layers on layers of processing, and the raw nociceptive input is processed in very complex ways, and then experience itself is processed in a different way. And when all of those are stacked on top of each other, that's when you get someone saying, this is awful, I feel pain, and I don't like the experience.
Terrific. And then the third thing that I wanted to ask before we get back into some of these things in more detail is whether or not you think there's something intrinsically valuable to a human being conscious.
Right. So the more I study the matter, the less it seems to be morally important, and the more it seems to be pragmatically important.
I find this to be a very interesting answer because I've also been thinking a lot about metaethics and whether or not there are moral facts and properties at all. And if you think that human life and consciousness aren't valuable, things that ought to be promoted, it just seems like that is maybe the sort of canonical good thing. And if you don't think that this is good and morally important, then you're probably a moral anti-realist and you don't think that there are good or bad things more generally.
Right. So, well, I mean, as a neuroscientist, I do think morality is a product of the brain. Mm-hmm. And I do think morality stems more from emotion than anything else.
Right. So the moral realist, there are debates in philosophy about what these terms ought to mean.
Yeah.
Thinks that there are mind-independent moral facts.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're a moral anti-realist on this classification because you think that moral facts are mind-dependent. They're things we generate.
Yes. On the other hand, I got a mind.
Exactly.
And so I have morals.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, of course, I'm a moral person and I want to support certain things and I'm very much against other things. And I think morals are typically the basic set of morals are really similar across people because our brains are very similar and we evolved in similar ways. And we're all enmeshed in human cultures which share similarities. So there's no question. It goes back to what I was saying about the color white. Like you can understand intellectually in one way, but you are a user, and so you cannot escape the other angle on it. I think this is the same thing with morality. I can understand intellectually the idea that morality evolved. And it's a construct of our brains, and it's really useful in any kind of larger social system. That's the intellectual side. Yeah. But I'm also a user, and I got them.
This isn't something I want to get into too much depth with, but you've said a number of very, this whole conversation you've been saying very interesting things, but in particular, a couple of words you just used are pragmatic and useful. And within metaethics, there is a family of views called moral quasi-realism. And the moral quasi-realist does not believe that there are these mind-independent moral truths, but they think that, again, speaking very loosely, that we ought to take a pragmatic and useful attitude toward these terms and recognize that we have minds that experience the world in a moral dimension, that they're very useful qualities for living as people, and so we ought to be pragmatically moral realists.
I see.
Is one way maybe of putting it.
I mean, I would say that it's not a matter of what we should be. We are. Mm-hmm. And when I look at it, when I put my scientist hat on, my interest is in what is and how did it get to be that way, not in what it should be. And so you look at evolution, how did these things evolve? I'm not interested in how it should evolve or how it should in the future. I think it is pragmatic. It is useful. It did evolve because it gave a survival advantage to creatures that live in communities or social communities to develop these ways of thinking. So I'm not sure I would advocate we should be moral because it's useful to us. I think I would say we are moral because it was useful to us through evolutionary time, and that is why we are. As for what we should be, I would say, as a user of a brain, I have all kinds of strong morals and strong ideas of what we should do, and what we should do, in my mind, is based on the internal use of those morals. Like, we shouldn't go around hurting each other. I'm quite certain of that. And it's not because it's useful, it's because I feel it.
Yeah.
My morals.
I think I'm in pretty much complete agreement with you, which is, it's very good to be on the same page. Now, before we move on, I want to take another little bit of a philosophical detour and talk about Daniel Dennett, who I got to speak with a couple of times on the show. I don't know if you were friends. I know that he really liked your work.
We met many, many times.
Many times. And for him, if I recall correctly, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but for him, language is something that is quite vital to consciousness and to minds. And in particular, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it is in his book, Kinds of Minds, he thinks that only humans and dogs are conscious. And this seems very contrary to what we've been saying today.
Yeah.
So I want to hear your thoughts on these things.
Yes. So we shared a lot in our perspectives. We're very similar in many ways, but there are some differences. And I think we both share the idea that the whole world inside the head is a construct of information processing. And when we say we're conscious, it's because a bundle of information describes us that way. And when we talk about magic and other kinds of essences and experiences and dualism, all of that derives from information, which in principle is understandable and in principle engineerable and buildable. So we were both materialists in this sense. I think he would put the models, the consciousness concepts at a higher level and at a culturally learned level. And so to him, people believe they're conscious, not to trivialize it, but sort of in the same way that kids believe that Santa Claus exists, because we grow up in a culture that tells us it's true until it gets so absorbed into us that we just believe it. And language is an incredibly important part of that process. And without language, we don't have the framework for describing ourselves to ourselves. So to him, it's a culturally learned phenomenon. To me, it's not. To me, it's way deeper than that. It's something built in. It's as deeply built in as, there's it's not an accident that I called it the attention schema, in parallel to the body schema. So the body schema is a built-in reflexive evolutionary adaptation. The brain builds a model of your body, and you can't help it. You can't turn it off. It's not like you learn culturally such that you know where your arms and your legs are. It's part of our perceptual machinery. So you close your eyes and you know where your arm is and how it's moving. And the body scheme is wonderful. It's simplified and it's sort of illusory. And that comes particularly clear when you do things like when people get an amputation, they lose an arm, but they still have a phantom arm. That's the body schema in their brains telling them that there's an arm there when there actually isn't. And so the body schema, the thing is we all have phantom limbs. All of us. I have a phantom limb. It's just my phantom limb happens to be coextensive with a real limb, and so the two move with each other. But if I had an amputation, then my phantom limb would exist without the real limb, right? So that's what the body schema is. It's not intellectual. It's not dependent on language. We didn't learn it like we learned about Santa Claus. We have it baked into us, but so does every other mammal on Earth. Probably every vertebrate on Earth has a body schema without which you can't even move your body appropriately. And so my take is that the thing we call consciousness is a model of how our brains function. And it's built in, and it's there from birth. It gets tuned up, but it's mostly there from birth. It evolved very deep in evolutionary time. It's automatic. You can't learn it. It's not a cultural adaptation. It has nothing to do with language. All people have it, but so do probably, like I said, all mammals, all birds, and probably some reptiles. And so in those ways, I'm really different from where Dennett is. So there's much more of an automatic reflexive component to the consciousness component as I theorize.
The idea that language is required for consciousness is quite counterintuitive. You don't have to be a philosopher or a neuroscientist for this. We look at dogs and we think, okay, they don't speak English or Japanese or anything else for that matter, but they strike us as conscious. And nonetheless, there are two examples that come to mind that make me question whether it really is this simple. One is an often cited passage, so I'm assuming that you would have encountered it at some point. Maybe it's even in one of your books, but it's this passage from Helen Keller's autobiography where, for our listeners, they can look it up, but she says something to the effect that until she learned language, she wasn't conscious. She uses these words. She was not conscious. She just was kind of this bumbling around, reacting sort of thing. And she doesn't even remember her life before she learned language. And the other somewhat similar example is less particular and more general. And it comes from this observation that none of us has memories of being an infant or even an early toddler. And it seems like our memories emerge around the time we start to learn language.
Yep. That's right. That's a very classic observation. I think that it is true that language restructures memory. I think it completely restructures how we encode our experiences and therefore how we remember them. And I think it becomes, at the very least, impossible to access memories that are not linguistically encoded. And so I wonder if we actually do have some of those old memories still somewhere in us, but we don't access them. But nonetheless, the main point, my main answer to that is a conflation. That sounds to me like a conflation between consciousness and memory. Because you can be conscious for some period of time and not remember it and come out of it later. So, for example, you're on a bicycle and you fall and you hit your head and you go unconscious. You will lose memory for maybe a minute and a half before the accident if you really get conked hard. It'll wipe your short-term memory before it can get consolidated into long-term memory. You wake up and all you remember is riding, a minute and a half before you hit the accident. That's as far as your memory goes. That's gone. That memory is gone. That doesn't mean you weren't conscious. It means the memory is gone. And I think people often conflate memory with consciousness. And so when you get into a case, I would imagine like the Helen Keller case, that she was conscious in the same senses that we mean it, experiencing and with these rich self models and so on. But when language came, it restructured her memory and she can't even access what that was like. And so then she says, I wasn't conscious. I can't remember it. It didn't exist. But I think that's a conflation of two processes of memory and consciousness.
Just to make sure that I understand this, let's say I remember a scent from 3 days ago.
Yeah.
The idea isn't necessarily that memory is linguistically encoded, but simply in virtue of the brain coming to use and implement language, the brain itself is restructured and you just cannot remember any memories from before that time period.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
right.
Okay.
So there's just to give another really interesting example. So language is one thing that structures memory. Another thing is space, and especially your sense of your own spatial perspective. And there's wonderful work now on out-of-body experiences, which you can induce in people. And there's wonderful paradigms from Henrik Ursen, who induces out-of-body experiences in people and does these really weird tactile visual manipulations and makes people feel like they're floating far away from their actual body. And it turns out that your memory, your autobiographical memory of what happens to you when you are feeling disembodied is terrible. Like you can barely remember the stuff that supposedly happened to you because it doesn't feel autobiographical. And your memory structure is designed to remember you experiencing things from the perspective of your body. And so you disrupt that mechanism and the memory starts to fail. So there's another example of how, yeah, you're right. It's not the events themselves, like the smells or the touches. It's that they get put into a larger framework, and the framework is partly constructed out of language and partly constructed out of your spatial concept of who you are and where you are in the world. And so, yeah, that's my answer to the Helen Keller thing. It's a conflation of memory and consciousness.
And she's conflating memory and consciousness, even though she describes her pre-linguistic experience as being very much like a fugue state where she wasn't really a self.
Right. So maybe there's two issues there. One is it sounds like she can't remember it very well. And the other is that the content of it is different. And so this is something worth pointing out, that the word consciousness has changed meaning over time.
Is it possible, I know that I'm cutting you off in the middle of a thought, but is it possible that just as language learning reconfigures the brain and how we access memory, it also reconfigures what consciousness is like?
I would say, from the point of view of the theories that we're working with, there's a very basic built-in mechanism, and it's there, and it's not going to change. There are layered concepts on top of it that change. And to go back to the example of white, there's a certain way that the visual system constructs white or reconstructs white, and we're all stuck with it. But on top of it, there's lots and lots of cultural associations. Like we learn about brides need to wear white because it's pure. White is like the color you want to paint your walls because it's pure and clean. And then there's other associations that come in, that are cultural in all kinds of other different ways. And we all learn these complex cultural associations that change our emotional tinge that we put on it. But the underlying perceptual model doesn't change. We're born with it. So I think the consciousness mechanism that as we study it is probably just there. But there's lots of complex cultural associations. So just the word consciousness, the person who coined the term stream of consciousness is William James. And that was about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. And to him, consciousness was not experience. It was the content. It was the stream of stuff in your brain. It was memories and colors and thoughts and emotions and all the content burbling along. That was consciousness, right? And so from that perspective, yeah, sure, your consciousness can change because the content changes and your concept of yourself changes. And interestingly, I think what happened was around the middle of the 20th century, as computers became more sophisticated, and you had people like Turing saying, hey, look, maybe these things can do what humans do. People began to feel threatened because if consciousness is just a stream of stuff and computers can do all the stuff, like they can remember and they can make decisions and they can take in visual input, then maybe computers are conscious like we are. And I think it was out of that this other more modern concept of consciousness emerged that you start getting the people like Nagel and like Chalmers saying, no, there's an extra essence. There's the extra what it feels like essence. And computers don't have that. And I think it was a reaction to computer technology. And I think one of the reasons why right now there's such a surge, I see a surge in the field of magical perspective on consciousness right now, of this almost desperate desire to make consciousness into something mysterious again, is because of LLMs. Because again, people are feeling really threatened by the computer technology. And so they're searching for an intellectual argument that allows them to feel that there's a magic. So these things, science is socially constructed, as they say.
I know that I keep piling on little tangents. I do want to get back to the shrimp and the mollusks and all these other sorts of things.
Yeah.
But you just mentioned that there's this surge in the magical theories of consciousness earlier in the conversation. You mentioned panpsychism and dualism, and I do want to set those aside because while I think they're philosophically interesting, they are utterly uninteresting to me for answering these questions about shrimp and mollusks because I think they're wrong. So I want to focus on one other competitor. I think it's a competitor to your theory. And this is the global workspace theory of consciousness. And I just want to ask, one, what it is both for me and for our listeners, and then why you prefer your model.
So global workspace theory, in essence, says, well, it's a theory of the human mind, and it might apply to other systems, but it was developed for humans. That in humans, you pay attention to stuff, and the things you pay attention to rise up and win a competition in your brain and become more processed. And some of that stuff eventually reaches a state where it's so enhanced, the signals are so enhanced that it can affect other systems around the brain in a widespread way. And that's called the global workspace. It's the collection of a small number of things at any one time that you're processing at high signal strength and great intensity. Sometimes it's has been called fame in the brain.
Dennett
called that fame in the brain, right? And so, but it's a limited number of things because we're surrounded by trillions of details, and at any one time, only a small number are reaching that, essentially the pyramid pinnacle of attention, the global workspace. From there, then it can affect other systems around the brain, like your speech and your decision making and your memory. And so that's a description of what is literally going on. I mean, that is apparently true in the brain. It's hard to argue with that, that a global workspace exists in that sense. It's probably more complicated than that, but that's a good general description of it. The global workspace theory of consciousness says when things get into your global workspace, that's when you have the experiential consciousness. That's what consciousness is. And so I always say of the global workspace theory that it's actually a very good theory, and it's wonderfully explanatory of everything, except as a theory of consciousness, it lacks one tiny little thing. It doesn't explain consciousness. It just says information gets in the magic box, and then the feeling is there. How? That's where the magicalism comes in, right? So that's the global workspace theory, and my particular concern with it. I think it's a great theory as far as it goes. I would say take the global workspace theory and pair it with this realization that the brain also builds models of itself, including it builds models of its own attention. It builds models of its own global workspace. And then you have a complete theory. Because now you have an explanation, not only for why, see, in the global workspace theory, I look at an apple. The theory explains why it is that the apple winning the attentional competition, getting into the global workspace, can then lead to speech circuitry saying, there's an apple, right? But in order to explain how the system says, I have a subjective experience, you got to have some other bundle of information in there. That's where models of self come in, models of the global workspace, models of attention. That's where the explanation lies for how that system asserts that it has conscious experience, right? So you take the global workspace, you add the attention schema theory, you put them together. I mean, they mesh very nicely together, but then you have an explanation for the behavior of the system. But the global workspace theory by itself is a magical theory. It says put things in the magic box and then experience emerges. And then somehow, because we have experience without any explanation, that allows us to say that we have it. Like there's a lot of things in the brain that we have that we can't say that we have. Like until science figured it out and people read it in books, nobody knew they had neurons in their brains. It's not like just because you have it in there, then you can verbally say it. Like you can't express something in words unless there's a bundle of information that gets into your cognition that tells you that you have that thing. So when people say, I have conscious experience, what's the bundle of information? Where does that come from? It isn't just, oh, I have experience, therefore I can say I have it. Like that's not an adequate explanation. So essentially, every theory of consciousness out there that I know of, except for AST, with the attention schema theory, every theory posits if you can explain how the experiential essence arises, then you're done. Because once it arises, then magically we can just say we have it. Right? But that doesn't make any sense. I call it arrow A and arrow B. Arrow A is how the brain produces the experience, if it does. Arrow B is how the experience impacts your speech machinery so you can say you have it. And theories of consciousness ignore arrow B, like as if it doesn't exist, as if they're all done now. They say, oh, the magic emerged. That's it. I'm done with my explanation. Well, how is it that you're walking around saying you have consciousness just because there's a magic essence emerging from your brain? Like what linked the magic essence to your cognitive machinery that thinks you have it and your speech machinery that says you have it? How do you get there? How do you connect those dots? So this is something that the attention schema theory does. And it plays really well with other theories. And the global workspace theory is one of those theories it plays really well with. You have to put them together, and then you got something.
At this point, we've covered a lot, and I'd like, before we move on, to try to summarize a few of the things we've said, just to make sure that I'm on the same page with them.
Yeah.
And then we'll get back into some of the specifics. So one, whether or not it is like something to be a human or another animal, this depends on whether or not that organism's information processing is sufficiently complicated that it has a self-model producing some sort of fiction of what it's like to be that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is that roughly on the same, roughly right? Okay. And then the second question is whether or not something is capable of suffering, and the answer to that question is, again, it's not all or nothing, but it is whether or not this organism's brain is complicated enough that its self-model involves suffering, and maybe more particularly whether or not it is attentive to its own pain in a certain way. Maybe you want to add more to this one.
I think those are all related, yes.
Okay.
I do think that if you're not attending to it, you're not conscious of it. Mm-hmm. This is something that has been fairly well established. Attention and consciousness almost always move around with each other. And so most of the time, if you're not attending to it, you're not conscious of it. And if you have pain and you're truly paying zero attention to it, then you're not conscious of it. Pain, unfortunately, tends to attract one's attention. Mm-hmm. So attention comes in and models your own rich models of yourself and models of your own attention come in. Yes. And that's what we call consciousness. Yeah.
And then that third point was whether or not there's some intrinsic value to life. And you and I, or consciousness more particularly, you and I both agree that there is not some mind-independent value to life, but maybe there are two questions here. One is whether or not human consciousness or animal consciousness is important to us and has value to us, and that is going to depend on how the individual is wired. But more particularly, I'm wondering if you think that it would be fair to say that an animal's life is valuable to it if, given that they don't have moral terms, they don't view, as far as I'm aware, most animals don't view the world in moral terms. Maybe if their self-model involves things like fear and love, which I do think animals are capable of, then we might want to say that there is some positive dimension to their being alive for them.
So one of the reasons why I have, in my own mind, slowly devalued the importance of consciousness is because I think I've come to realize how little a part of the larger machine it really is. And so for people, for, the average person out there, of course, the only thing they experience is what's in their consciousness. So that's everything. And so through everyday life, you have no concept of just how much is going on in there. That's not part of the little tiny bit of consciousness stuff. I realize more and more that the mechanism that we're calling consciousness here, this mechanism is limited and really important in some circumstances for survival and for useful behavior, but also in some sense very limited. So I wonder if maybe animals without consciousness have a lot of value to them anyway, just because they're rich, complicated things with a lot of stuff going on up in there, even if it doesn't plug into a consciousness mechanism. I wonder if there's an enormous amount I don't know what moral value is. I don't know what the right way is to think about that. But I increasingly wonder if conscious versus not conscious is the right lens or the right litmus test for deciding morally valuable and not morally valuable. Like, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that that's the right answer. Yeah, I guess I would put it that way.
Without any further delay now, I would like to talk about very specific animals.
Shrimp. You got to the shrimp.
Well, before we get to the shrimp, of which there are two varieties. I think that there's the pineid shrimp and then there's the carneid shrimp. We mainly eat pineid shrimp, so Atlantic, Gulf shrimp. These are pineid shrimp. But this other family of shrimp, they're more really just like bottom dwellers burrowing around in the sand, and we don't eat them as much, even if they're the true shrimp. But before we even get to those creatures, I have recently started eating scallops. But I would first like to talk about bivalves and how... So you're not Is an ichthyologist just somebody who studies fish?
I believe so.
Okay, well, you're not a marine biologist.
I am not.
So I know that, or I'm assuming that you don't have a very detailed knowledge of the anatomy of these creatures or the neuroscientific research on them. But let's just start with scallops and hear what you have to say.
Okay.
And then I'll maybe ask more questions.
Yeah. You're right, I don't. I have only very briefly in, studying the evolution of complex nervous systems, dipped into the organization in creatures like this. Octopuses are on the same lineage as bivalves and scallops and so on. So it has been said octopuses represent the most alien intelligence to humans that you can get on Earth because they're so distant in evolutionary space. But I don't think that shrimp clams and other bivalves have a brain. I think they have ganglia.
They don't have a brain.
They have a collection of ganglia that perform various kinds of...
And what are ganglia?
So a ganglion is a clump of neurons that is interconnected, that computes stuff. And it's usually relatively small, and you usually have lots of them sprinkled throughout a body that helps locally control processes. And we have them all over our bodies, and we don't consider them to be part of our conscious minds. And this is something worth noting, by the way, that the consciousness that we think we have is this tiny part of our brain. And for example, the spinal cord, most people don't consider their spinal cord conscious, is more sophisticated by far than any of these creatures you're talking about. Like the amount of processing going on, the amount of intelligence in the human spinal cord or the human stomatogastric ganglion and other ganglia around their body far exceeds that of these other creatures.
When you say these other creatures, are you exclusively referring to the bivalves at this point?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So something like an octopus develops a much larger, basically a ganglion that grows and becomes a brain. But if you're talking about, insects even, or shrimp, or spiders, or bivalves, or
I just want to
snails.
stick to bivalves
Okay.
for the moment.
Bivalves. Bivalves are fascinating. When I was little, we had a vacation house. We still do, or my parents do, in upstate New York, and we'd wander around, and in the streams way in the back, in this very fieldsy, woodsy area, we'd find these fossil, millions and millions of fossils, little shells. Like millions and millions of these creatures died and fell to the bottom of a warm sea and got pressed into rock. And there's just literally every rock you pick up is crammed full of these little shells. They're little bivalve shells. And we went to the museum. They said, 400 million years old, Devonian period. They're from a long time ago, these little guys. Bivalves have been around for a long time. And I would say long before the evolution of the kinds of brain structures that serve what we think of as consciousness or experience. They're little machines that do stuff. So I think that there is a tendency in the world of animal consciousness to intentionally mix up processing with experience, and to say, well, it processes this and then it reacts that way, and then to use the language of it experiences this and chooses that. And that's all over the world of animal consciousness. And so it is possible to write about bivalves and say, well, they experience this in order to do that, and they experience internal states. But that's not use of the word experience in the same sense. That just means the information got in and something processed it. So I think bivalves have the neural machinery to process information and tweak that and, make the little foot move and open the thing. And they have that. But I don't think they have anything vaguely like experience in the sense that the consciousness scholars would refer to it.
Because they do not have the sufficiently complex enough internal model, or any internal model, really.
That's right.
To manifest these sorts of things.
That's right. It's almost like saying, I'm going to go back to color again. We're creatures that process color. We evolved that way. But imagine you have a creature like a bivalve with no eyes, and it doesn't process color. And then you ask, well, but does it have color experience? No, because it's not processing that information. It doesn't work. Its processing doesn't work in that domain. It doesn't have that information. So that makes no sense. And so I think the same thing's going on. It doesn't have information about what a mind is, or what experience is, or that it has it. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have that. It doesn't process that kind of information about itself. And so it makes no sense to ask, well, but does it have experience? Like, no. Just like it doesn't have color perception because it doesn't have the color processing machinery. So I think that's insane. There are lots of people who would argue it, but I think it's insane.
Maybe going forward, what I should do, or before we go forward, I should tell you just how I'm thinking about eating animals right now.
Okay.
And not that you're particularly interested in my eating behavior, but it might help you understand how I'm thinking when we talk about some other animals. Basically, I do not want to eat animals or contribute to animal suffering if I don't have to. So I am eating scallops.
Oh.
The other animal products that I'm eating right now are only two. One is venison, not because I don't think that deer can suffer, but because there are deer specifically on Maui in Hawaii that are being culled because they're an invasive species, and this meat is sold to consumers. So to me, in a way, it's kind of like a free lunch, literally, and figurative. Well, I do have to pay for it, but they would be being killed anyway, and nothing I could really... I would prefer it if they were all heli lifted to in India or wherever they're... But that's not going to happen, so I'm okay with eating them for this reason. The other thing, and I haven't done this yet, is I found one dairy. There's only one dairy in the country that is entirely slaughter-free. And the cows seem to live marvelous lives, so I'm going to consume those dairy products. But I'm now in the stage where I've got my baseline and I want to move up the animal hierarchy and think about which animals I'm comfortable eating, because I don't want to eat the ones that are either capable of suffering or where I feel like there's really some value to their lives. Scallops, I feel very minimal remorse for eating.
Yeah.
But now I want to move to shrimp, which are the next thing up that I'm curious about. So let's get
right.
to those Gulf delicious shrimp.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about that. First, the biggest obstacle people have to solving this problem of what has consciousness, especially in this moral sense, is not scientifically figuring out what consciousness is and scientifically figuring out what has it. It's the fact that we evolved as social animals to attribute consciousness to the things around us. We cannot help it.
What surprised me about what you just said is I thought you were going to say is there is not sufficient data, because I spent a couple of days researching shrimp and there is not that much data about shrimp.
Right.
Consciousness.
Right.
Shrimp brains.
Well, right. Shrimp brains.
Nervous system.
Right. Although, shrimp are, arthropods, and there's tons on crayfish, and they're probably really similar. Crayfish and lobsters. Some of the initial work on the basic properties of neurons was done on crayfish. But anyway, so it's super easy for people to look at anything, especially a moving agentic creature, and see consciousness in it. And this is essentially what everyone does. And so, we both refer to the question of whether octopuses have consciousness. Literally, everyone who says they have it seems to say, their reasoning seems to be, I just know it because I have spent time with them.
Or they've seen my octopus teacher.
Or that, Their reasons have nothing to do with the actual octopus. It has to do with the social machinery in the human brain. Okay, everyone knows that their pet dog has consciousness. It might. Like, scientifically, to me, that is plausible and it fits with the theories we're working with. But the real reason why people say that is because their social machinery attributes consciousness to their dogs. We are so prone to do that. Okay, so no matter where you go, there's a wonderful YouTube channel that tracks the progress of Leon, the lobster, who got rescued from a supermarket. And this guy has Leon in a tank. And it's actually really cool. It's marvelous. And Leon has grown and molted several times, and he lives a wonderful life now. And he's got fans, and everyone knows that Leon is a conscious creature with feelings and experiences. Why? Not because of any scientific evidence or reason. It's because human social cognition attributes that to the things around us if they behave in any kind of complicated agentic manner, right? And so you're going to run into this. Like, this is the essential way that people decide what they're going to eat and not eat. And so there are people who are going to look at shrimp and say, I just know that they're conscious. Like, I had sea monkeys when I was young, and they were my friends, and I got to know them, and I just know they have a soul inside of them. So that's probably the prime way that people make this kind of decision. I think you're hoping for a different kind of answer.
Absolutely, I am.
Yeah. And all I can say is there are lots of different theories of consciousness. And if you rely on the theory that I work with, they don't got it. Shrimp don't got it. Like, you can go all the way up through the shrimp and probably fish, and like, they react to their environments, but I don't think they process information about what a mind is, or that they have conscious minds, or that they have feelings. They don't process that kind of self-information. They process sensory information. They process sensory information from inside the body and from outside the body, and they process movement control and so on. I don't think they have that theory of mind type of information that we use when we say, I have a conscious mind. So if you use my theory, my theoretical structure, then you're good, pretty darn far up the food chain. But there are other theories that you might choose to subscribe to instead that say, sorry, all the way down to the bacteria level, they're all conscious. And there's all kinds of theories in between that makes it very hard to make that decision.
I am sorry if I'm being too pedantic by wanting to focus on the specific animals.
Yeah.
But while I, of course, recognize that you're a leading authority in the world, maybe the leading authority in the world on this, I think the leading authority on this theory of consciousness, it's vital to me that I understand why for each of these particular animals, it is not capable of suffering on this theory. And I understand, I'm very comfortable with the scallops, but I would like to talk about the shrimp in particular. They have nociceptors. I know this, but they have some mechanism analogous to the way humans detect pain.
Yeah.
But of course, with humans, as you laid out, it goes nociceptor, spinal cord, thalamus, cortex. Shrimp don't have these things. Yeah. So I'm wondering just what it is about the shrimp's circuitry that leads you to cut the line off, say they don't got it.
Well, I don't think they have attention in the same way that people do. I don't think they have a model of their own attention in the same way that people do. So I don't think they're capable of, like, if you could somehow poke wires into the shrimp brain, extract information, and then translate it into English, the Speechinator 5000 that you plug into an animal, and then you get the linguistic output. And somehow you could ask it, what is your experience? I don't think it would know what experience is, because it's not processing that kind of information. So if it's in pain and you say, what is it like to experience pain? It doesn't know. It's not computing information in the domain of what things are like, what experience is. It doesn't have that. That's theory of mind. It doesn't have that. So it's processing raw inputs that we call pain because they're inputs that signal damage, but it can't process this other layer of information. Like, why would it? You have to go way higher. I think most amphibians lack that. Most fish lack that. I think you have to get way higher up into the complexity of, like I said, some reptiles, mammals, and birds before you get to that.
But when we look at a shrimp, is there something that you could point to if we pulled up a model or a diagram of its nervous system? You could say, here, this is where the structures that are necessary for it to develop this self-model is missing. That's what I'm kind of looking for, because we're starting with the nociceptors, so it's good up to that point. Where is it that we're able to cut off the line and say, okay, it's missing this more advanced machinery?
Well, it's a little hard because the shrimp isn't organized like a vertebrate. So you can look at vertebrates and say, well, they have this, but they lack that. I mean, you can look at a fish and say, look, it has all these nice components, but the telencephalon, the front part of the brain, is barely there, and it's lacking. It doesn't grow into a real cortical structure, and it doesn't do this, and it doesn't process that. But you look at another mammal and or another vertebrate, and it has more of this and more of that. So it's not like the shrimp has a primitive, simple thing that lacks this, that, and that. It's more like the shrimp belongs on a different branch, right? It's just organized differently. It's organized around ganglia, and it probably has a larger ganglion somewhere in there that could nominally be called a brain, but it's probably mostly local distributed ganglia controlling different parts of its body, right? So there is, as far as I know,
I think the shrimp is actually decentralized too.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, I think that to suggest that the shrimp contains the theory of mind processing machinery to even encode or represent the information about what a mind is, or what an experience is, or what experiential pain is kind of silly. Like, there's no evidence.
Yeah.
There's no behavioral evidence from a shrimp that it does that. I mean, it would be very odd to propose that hypothesis, let's just say.
One of the reasons that I'm very concerned about shrimp, and I recognize that this is the social machinery that you were talking about, is I looked into shrimp farming practices. And have you ever done this?
No.
Okay. Well, I find this incredibly fascinating, but at the same time, macabre.
Oh.
and sorry for the French pronunciation. That was terrible of me to do that. But in the shrimp farming process, shrimp eyes are ablated, so they will crush or burn off one of the female shrimp's eye stalks, because this will make them produce eggs for some reason. They have very different brains from ours.
Huh.
And beyond just the conditions that we would assume would be deplorable for a shrimp in which they live, this seemed barbaric and inhumane and terrible, and made me not want to eat farmed shrimp.
Yeah.
But if they lack minds, if they are not experiencing pain, then no problem, really.
Yeah. I mean, but it's sort of interesting. I always find it interesting when people look to science as inspiration for their moral decisions, because I always think that it's maybe a misplaced search, because science doesn't say anything about what should or shouldn't be true. And like I said, your morals stem from something else, from an emotional place. And if you look at the shrimp and you just think that's barbaric, then don't eat them. Like, what's wrong with that? Even if in some scientific sense they don't have minds.
Well, you look at the shrimp and you think it's barbaric because you're projecting your own suffering onto them.
Yeah.
When I see a shrimp's eye being ablated, I just assume, I think of myself as this little shrimp and my eye being just crushed.
Yeah.
Maybe this shrimp Robinson is having less sophisticated thoughts, but I'm looking to science to perhaps disabuse me of this notion and give me a more accurate picture of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think I would anger large numbers of people out there, but I will say that in the theoretical framework that I work in, no, they don't have that.
I'm not concerned with arguing with angering people about this. I'm concerned without being dramatic. I'm concerned with what's true,
right?
Not people's emotions about these issues.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, we're talking about my emotions about these issues. But okay, I am feeling much more comfortable with eating shrimp, and that's good for me. Maybe doesn't mean anything for you, but
I eat chickens, so that's way high up there. I'm sure chickens are conscious.
Interesting.
I'm munching away on them.
One of my best friends, I'm not going to name him, he's a really brilliant person, a philosopher at Stanford, and he does not think that chickens are conscious.
Oh.
And he says for him the best theory is the global workspace model.
Ah.
So, and I'm not sure how familiar he is with your work, but I'm not sure it so much hinges on consciousness as much as it hinges on whether or not chickens are capable of suffering. I don't know if this information is accurate, but he has told me that there have been studies conducted where you have two chambers in which a chicken to which a chicken has access. In one, there is a reasonable amount of food. In the other, there is a plethora of food, but the chicken might get shocked. It might be incredibly hot in the room, all sorts of things, and they are just gangbusters for that really uncomfortable room with lots of food. In my research on shrimp, I came across this very interesting study about hermit crabs, where hermit crabs are, the most exciting thing in the world for them is finding a new shell that is much more thrilling than the shell that they already have.
Yeah.
And so they took these hermit crabs and they gave them the opportunity to move into this really awesome new deluxe shell that they had lined with electrodes. And the extent to which they had to torture these hermit crabs to get them to leave the really nice shell was pretty absurd.
Yeah, I don't know the studies, but that sounds like a total, they missed the point. Because you can do that to people too. Like you offer someone $1 billion and you can get them to do a lot of nasty things.
I think that you're making a very good point here.
You tell someone, okay, we'll saw your foot off without anesthesia, but we're going to give you $1 billion. And then they do it. And you say, oh, people don't have, like those poor people, they don't suffer.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with that logic there.
Yeah, so. Very interesting. Okay, shrimp aside, I'm feeling more comfortable about shrimp and crustaceans, though, of course, I'm going to have to think a bit more about this beyond the conversation. But admittedly, the way that I am conducting this investigation is I'm thinking about the animals that I like eating. I do not particularly like eating I've never had jellyfish. So I'm not particularly concerned about how conscious jellyfish are. I really like shrimp. I really like cured salmon. So salmon is the next thing I wanted to talk about. And when I was reading about salmon consciousness, one of the reasons that people suggested that salmon don't have consciousness, and this, I don't know how you will react to this in relationship to the attention schema, but it's that so much of their behavior is driven apparently by pure instinct. Like they're just trying to get up this river, they're trying to mate. It doesn't seem like they are making complicated decisions. The narrative is, oh, they're on autopilot, they are not conscious.
Yeah, that's a silly argument. People are also very driven by, these kind of instinctive or reflexive behaviors. There's all kinds of weird drives built into animals, and so I don't think that means anything. And there's a lot of the world of animal consciousness is a bit obsessed with complexity of behavior, and so there's this whole
ants are complex.
Ants. Bees are a favorite because bees have really complex behavior, and people say, "Oh my God, they're conscious. They have complex behavior. That's it. Ta-da!" And then, the example of the salmon you just gave. Well, they have behavior, and in some sense it's complex, but it's also very autopilot-y, instinctive, so maybe they're not conscious. Like, none of that means anything, because none of that has anything to do with this question of the experiential component. And, in the way that the philosophers, what I would call magical-minded people, think about it, I don't think they would agree with that either. And I don't agree with it either, even though I don't think that there's a magical component in there. I think what we say we have an experiential component because we have brains that process information in that domain about who we are and what our minds are. But none of those studies of bee complexity or salmon complexity, none of it addresses that. It's all about, is it so complex? Is the agent behaving in a complex enough way that my social machinery can attribute a human-like mind to it or not. And you see the salmon going up the river, and you're like, nah, that's not similar enough to that I can attribute my human-like, I can't anthropomorphize that, so I'm not conscious. And that just seems silly to me, and it seems to miss the point. So I don't agree with that argument. On the other hand, if the theory that I work on is correct, then salmon probably don't have consciousness anyway.
Okay, so salmon have nociceptors, they have spinal cords, I don't know which of the other brain regions they have that would be relevant to this, but since they are organized more like humans than shrimp are, is it easier for you to explain with reference to the neuroscience, given that you're not an ichthyologist, why you're so confident that they don't suffer or have experience?
Well, I think they have the mechanisms of pain that we have. In other words,
nociceptors.
Yes. And they have,
so do shrimp.
Yeah, and they have some of the central connections that we have, some of them. But what does a salmon lack? It lacks a cortical system. It lacks the thing that processes the information that we say we're conscious of. Like, it's literally missing the parts of the brain that give us our consciousness. So whatever theory of consciousness you subscribe to, if you look at clinical patients and you see what they're missing and whether they're conscious or not, it's the cortex and the subcortical structures that connect directly to it, like the thalamus, and there's a couple other structures that are all involved in this big complicated loop. I mean, yeah. So the comparison is a bit easier with the fish because they have all these other components. They have the brainstem, and they have a cerebellum, and they have a tectum and other components in there that we have as well in one form or another. But I think you have to get pretty far up that branching evolutionary tree, pretty far up the complexity of the brain, of the forebrain, of the cortex, before you start getting these self models.
When we observe a salmon, sorry for the dramatic language, fighting for its life at the end of a line, and it's bleeding and it comes out and it's flopping and appears to be suffering, given what you referred to as this social machinery in our brains, are we making this conflation of complex behavior with experience that you were just alluding to earlier?
Yeah.
Okay.
On the other hand, I feel sorry for the things.
That I find, okay.
I feel sorry for trees when they get cut down.
Me too.
I don't want those trees cut down. This is awful. That tree's been there a long time. I just feel so sorry for that tree. And it has nothing to do with whether it has experience or brain or anything.
It's just because of how you're constructed.
Yeah. So I'm happy to feel sorry for the salmon. But scientifically, I do not think it has a self model. And so while it's reacting to pain signals, I don't think it has anything like experience in the sense that we do. That's what I would guess. I think the experiential, phenomenological experience is not there.
I think that this is an analogy that you might not like, but it's more like a computer in the sense that it's obviously, because we're just as mechanical as a computer is or as a salmon is, but the salmon is mechanical in the way that a car or a computer is, but in a way that we are not, just because we have this other mechanical component that is the self model.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, and things are going to get a little squirrelier with these kinds of comparisons when the computers start getting that layer as well.
Okay.
And then it's going to get harder to use that vocabulary.
Okay. Salmon, interesting. And just for my future reference, if I wanted to Google this, or if our listeners wanted to Google this, you said that the cortex in humans is what is responsible for the sort of cognition that we associate with the self model, and it is the cortex that a salmon lacks?
Yeah.
Do they have a primitive cortical-like structure?
So they have something called a telencephalon, or the very front part of the brain. And it has, so it's tiny, but in evolutionary time it grows and it gets much, much, much bigger and eventually turns into this thing in reptiles called the wulst. And the wulst then...
And birds.
And famously in birds, right. So reptiles, I mean, this whole world of... reptiles is probably not the right word for it, but there's a split. And one lineage goes through the dinosaurs into the birds, and the other one goes through mammal-like reptiles into mammals, and, here we are. And so this part of the bird brain and the human cortex are homologous. But you can trace it back, in a sense, to this little nub at the front of the fish brain. But it's really not serving the same kind of functions. And fish really don't have what I would call this cortical style attention, which is the heart of our consciousness, right? And so when you look at a human, at least, take a look at a human, you look at clinical cases and you ask, what are the people who have deficits in consciousness, who are really, what's the minimal damage such that the person is just not conscious? That's a little tricky because, of course, you can kill someone and then they're not conscious, and you can kill them with a very small lesion at the base of the brain, I guess. But if you look at what you can damage such that the rest of the brain is still functioning, what goes wrong such that the person is non-responsive, lying there unaware, unresponsive, unconscious. And there's certain areas that are in kind of two clumps, in the back of the brain and the front of the brain, roughly in the temporoparietal region, as it's called, and in the frontal lobes. These are the cortical areas that, when damaged, lead to this profound kind of deep coma. These are the cortical areas that process exactly what I'm talking about. The models of self and other, models of minds. These are the areas that answer the question when you ask people, are you conscious? Do you have subjective experience? Something in there has to answer those questions. Something in there knows what the questions mean because they process information in the right domain. Those are the areas. And so those get damaged, then you lose this whole consciousness thing. But fish don't have that.
I'm going to Tokyo in a few weeks.
Oh, right.
And so there will be a lot of fish being served. And if I'm not mistaken, earlier you said that you believe most fish don't have this, or did I mishear you and you believe that no fish have this self-model?
So, to be clear, first of all, you're talking about a scientific theory. And I think the theory is right. But the details are not necessarily 100% known. And so I can only guess.
When you say that they're not 100% known, you're saying that, let's say, in the case of the salmon, it is conceivable that they have some other neural structure that produces a self-model other than the cortex, or you're saying that something else is missing or something else is not known just about how attention relates to what we think of as subjective experience?
I would say I am 99.5% sure that salmon don't have the structures necessary. Okay. But I could always be wrong in some way that's totally unanticipated. I'm much more sure, even though 99.5 already sounds really sure, I'm much more sure of the fundamentals of this theory.
Okay.
But exactly how different brains relate to the theory is, there's a lot that's not known. It's not like people have done vast amounts of neuroscience on fish. There is actually a fair amount, but it's not like people studied the details of the forebrain of the fish. So I put that out as a caveat. The answer is, in the context of this theory, as the details seem to fall into place, no fish, absolutely no fish has anything like that. The only animal that I know of that is outside that lineage that might have the same kinds of processes as octopus or cuttlefish.
By outside that lineage, you mean creatures, sea-dwelling creatures that are not mammals
The only creatures,
or reptiles.
the only creatures I know of, other than vertebrates at the reptile, bird, or mammal level, other than that, the only other creature I know of that has a potential for having these kinds of models of self would be the octopus.
Okay, terrific. I love calamari.
Yeah.
And I love grilled octopus. So, I mean, this raises more interesting scientific and philosophical challenges because you said that they have nervous systems very unlike ours. They're at the opposite end of this evolutionary divergence. So how do you go about considering the question whether octopuses, squid, cuttlefish have these self-models?
It's hard because so much of the work on octopuses, so much of the reports and language around octopus consciousness is tinged with this human social cognition. So that makes it very difficult. But the thing I see about octopuses that strikes me as really interesting is that they're so visual. And vision is this thing that's intensively requires attention because so much information comes in through vision. You have to use a visual filter, and they're not just visual, they're visual predators, which means they're focusing in on prey and filtering out other stuff. And so they're creatures that need really good top-down control over their own attention. And on top of that, they obviously are enormously intelligent creatures. That is, they have problem-solving abilities.
What's very interesting to me is that I think another conflation that people make is intelligence with experience.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to me that you don't say it is necessary that because they're highly intelligent, they must have these self-models.
Yeah. I mean, self-driving cars are just ridiculously intelligent at this point, and not too many people think that they have experience. Mm-hmm. I mean, people argue whether ChatGPT has experience. I don't think too many people think a self-driving car does. And I think a self-driving car would give a lot of these so-called intelligent animals a good run for their money in terms of intelligence. So octopuses are very intelligent. They're able to solve problems. I think they become intelligent because the evolutionary pressures of being a visual predator.
Now, there is a bug in this.
A bug?
There is a bug.
Oh, right.
The bug is the mantis shrimp.
Aha.
Are you familiar with the mantis shrimp?
I know about mantis shrimps, but I'm not sure I know too much about their neuroscience.
The bug with the
have the
mantis
really
shrimp,
fast.
They have incredibly powerful claws. Yeah, they can easily break human fingers off.
Right.
But they have the most advanced visual system in the animal kingdom, and they're visual predators. And yet they have a nervous system they're more advanced than the Penaeid shrimp that I was describing earlier, but it's not on the level of a fish or even though they hunt fish, but it's not on the level of an octopus either. So I'm curious about why, if I'm just going to assume for sake of argument that the mantis shrimp doesn't have this self-model, even though it has a very complicated visual system, just what the connection is then between the visual system and the self-model.
So, I don't know that much about the visual organization in shrimp. I do know that they have really weird eyes. They have among the weirdest eyes in the animal kingdom.
Somehow connected to egg laying, as we have.
Yeah. I know they don't have a lens, they have a mirror system. Like their eyes have a whole bunch of mirrors that individually focus light in a really interesting way. And so their optics are really bizarre. But how their brains are organized, I don't know. The link between vision and self-models, to me, is really sophisticated vision seems to me requires attention. Just because by the nature of vision that there's an enormous amount of information that floods in and you can't process all of it. So you have to be very strategic about what you're processing and how deeply you process this versus that. Once you have attention come in, then you have the need for top-down control of attention. Once you have top-down control over something, you have need for a model of it because you have to monitor it and predict it. And so now you have models of attention, and now you're at least getting into the territory of the initial low-level components that I think ultimately make up our consciousness, right? So that's the direction that I see that going. I'm not saying octopuses have these things. I'm just saying a lot of people say they're conscious, and when I look somewhat casually at the octopus world, I think, yeah, I mean, it could be. It could be, because that's an interesting connection. I don't quite know how to study it, but it seems vaguely plausible to me.
You don't know how to study it because their brains are so radically different from ours?
Yeah, I think you would have to first establish what are the dynamics of attention in an octopus. What does it mean for an octopus to pay attention to one thing versus another thing, and how good is it at that, and can it control its own attention, and all this. Like, you'd have to really start from the ground up and do an enormous amount of work.
I have not seen my octopus teacher because, do you know what I'm referring to?
No, but I assume it's some kind of popular fiction.
Yes. Yeah, no, not fiction.
Oh.
It's a documentary, again, I have not seen it, that is extremely popular, that details a man's relationship with an octopus.
Huh.
Not a sexual relationship. I think it's just an octopus in the wild.
Yes, that is good.
It's just an octopus in the wild. And they developed a friendship, I think, and they played together. Evidently, the octopus teaches him something, but what that is up for speculation because neither of us has seen the documentary. But it seems like octopuses have personalities and are capable of engaging in play, just based on my minimal understanding of this movie and how people have reacted to it. And given that sort of information, and also given what we were saying about dogs' ability to play and also the attention they pay to their owners, would this sort of information raise your credence that octopuses are conscious?
In this sense, that I don't think it's easy to get along with a person unless you share some of the same dynamics.
Because they are so complicated that in order to predict their behavior, you really need to have this secondary model of attention, and this is kind of bootstrapped and developed based on a first order attention schema because you think that this came first, at least for humans.
Yeah, but also, if the octopus were really radically different in its mind, it might be a little hard for a person and an octopus to make friends with each other. Like, one of the reasons why people and dogs get along is because our minds work in a similar way. And
really?
So, sure. So it strikes me that maybe if a person and an octopus play together and get along together, one of the reasons might be, at the very least, that octopuses have attentional dynamics somewhat similar to ours. Otherwise, I don't see how there's a resonance between person and octopus. So that might make me think, yeah, there's some similarities there.
And that would be quite surprising, given, as you said, how far removed we are from one another.
Yeah.
But what is it about humans and dogs' minds that makes you believe that they're so similar?
Oh, well, I mean, it's been theorized that dogs have a pack structure, a social structure that's not all that dissimilar to humans. And so they intrinsically understand things like authority and a hierarchy, and they are very auditory. And so they intrinsically understand the tone and concept of words that mean things. Their facial expressions are not that different from ours. And so there's a reason why we get along really well with dogs. people talk about cats. Cats are obviously super popular pets, but the trope is that cats are cold or, unemotional or not very well connected. And I presume the reason is because they're just a little bit less similar in how they react socially.
I have had a lot of experience with both cats and dogs.
Yeah, so actually.
Yeah, and I had one cat that it is hard to say just how much I'm emotionally compromised and projecting, but I really felt that this cat on some primitive level understood me, and we had a very deep connection, and the cat knew what I was going to do and knew how I was feeling and this sort of thing. But I suppose that if we are really just fundamentally this dissimilar relative to our similarity with dogs, it seems more likely that I was projecting onto this.
It could be, but also it could just be, it's a relative thing, so that in the range of cats, fewer of them are intrinsically resonating with people.
Yeah.
In the range of dogs, much more of them can readily interact with people. So I spent a long time, ages and ages ago, I worked in a lab that studied monkeys. We did all kinds of behavioral studies with them. And so we'd have to take them out of their, home colony and interact with them and feed them little treats and so on. And it always struck me how different they are from dogs. And monkeys are way smarter than dogs, but they don't feel like it. Actually, they feel kind of dumb compared to a dog.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and monkeys are supposed to be very human-like, and yet they felt alien. And you never really made friends with them. You tried your best, and maybe at best you had a kind of a truce with them, and you fed them, and they were okay with you. But I realized among the biggest differences, the monkeys are not good with auditory signals, and dogs are, and almost everything we do with each other has to do with these subtle auditory cues. They don't learn their names. They don't react to the human voice in the same way.
Are apes better in this way than monkeys?
I think that humans are considered to be uniquely auditory. We have this ridiculously complex auditory communication system.
That's also interesting, but I meant, is it more feasible to develop a friendship with an ape than with a monkey?
I think, yeah, people develop very deep, close relationships with their ape friends.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like Coco the gorilla and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
There are 3 other types of animal that, at least one of them, birds, have come up in this conversation. But while we're talking about animals qua food products, I think that we should talk about them. Birds, you think, are sophisticated enough, especially the corvids, I take it, to have these self-models. And I think corvids pass like this mirror test where they can recognize themselves in a mirror, and without knowing the details myself, I assume that this has something to do, some connection to a self-model. But what I was going to ask is where you think chicken, turkey, these sorts of food birds fall into this spectrum, and then why it is that you feel a more personal question, why does you feel comfortable eating them?
So let me start with the mirror test. Mirror test is often used as a test of self-awareness. I'm profoundly skeptical of it. It may be true. It may be a good way to test in some circumstances, but the problem is it also just tests visual spatial ability. So even someone who knows all about themselves, if they're not familiar with the visual spatial properties of a mirror, that would be really confusing, and they wouldn't be passing that test. And I think you can, if you take a turtle and you irritate it, it'll scratch itself where you're irritating it with its flipper.
Shrimp will do that too.
Shrimp will do that. This is very simple. The mirror test is just a test of whether they can use complex visual information to do the same thing, right? So I'm very skeptical that that's really a philosophically valid, tight test of self-concept. So we start with that. But corvids also pass false belief theory of mind tests. And so they have this really rich concept of other agents and what other agents are thinking and knowing. I think birds are typically very social animals. I mean, not all species, but many species are hugely social. They probably have enormous social intelligence. They probably have theory of mind. They probably have built into them these, reflexive first-order concepts of mind and experience and self and so on. I think that's very likely. I think probably all birds have this in them. And then, you have some birds that are more intelligent than others, but that's, as we've said, a little bit independent of the question of whether they have this experiential component. Why do I eat chickens? I just do. I'm a carnivore. I don't eat cows and pigs and so on.
You don't?
I don't for three reasons. One, it's less healthy for me. Two, it's less healthy for the world because, environmentalism. I mean, it's a very enormous drain on the environment to grow and deal with cows. And number three, I actually am not that fond of it.
Okay.
But chicken I eat. And I've tried to go vegetarian. It just didn't work nutritionally. It was really hard to do. And I didn't really feel very physically comfortable. It's like it impacted my energy levels and so on. So I gave it up. I eat chicken. I think chicken.
Seafood too, I take it.
Yeah, occasionally. I'm not. Probably most of the meat I eat is chicken, like 95% of it. So, and I don't eat that much of it actually. But yeah, I mean, I think like most people, I'm, in terms of my own personal behavior, very morally contradictory and full of inconsistencies. And you could argue that that's one of them. I think they have what we would think of as a type of consciousness.
Something that just came to mind that you might find interesting is I read this very lengthy review of whether or not creatures such as shrimp, lobsters, crabs, all the way up to octopuses are conscious. And this was done by a panel of, there were some philosophers, some neuroscientists, some animal welfare people, and a major point of this was setting regulations in the UK. And one of the tests they were doing to determine whether or not creatures were conscious was they would administer an irritant to them somewhere. And if they scratched or indicated what we would think of as discomfort at this irritant, this was a mark toward consciousness, which is interesting because, again, this is a conflict. It's not that complex behavior cannot be correlated with consciousness, but it is a conflation that it equates to consciousness.
Yeah, totally. It's, I mean, these panels remind me of, panels of religious scholars deciding how many angels dance on the head of the pin.
Right.
And they get very serious about it. And I think it's totally out to lunch.
Okay, the last two, well, actually, before I ask about the last two animals, if you had to put a number on it from 0 to 1, credence that octopuses are sufficiently conscious as to be capable of suffering, where would you put that?
Well, the problem is I lack information.
I get that you aren't an expert on this. You lack tons of information, but
so logically, then I would put it at 0.5 because I have no idea.
But you wouldn't put it at 0.5 about, I don't know, some insect that we've never discovered before, something like that.
An insect I would put very low.
Right, but octopuses, you're sufficiently, and you don't know enough. Yeah, okay. That's right. That 0.5. Okay, I'm glad that that's enough for me to not eat octopuses. But then I don't eat them.
I used to, because I've been to Japan too, and they have really good octopus there.
Yeah.
But I stopped partly for that reason. I was like, oh, this poor thing.
Is it the same for squid?
I think squid and octopus are really similar.
Okay. Because squid don't seem to have as sophisticated behavior as
That's true.
octopuses. I don't know how that would affect your credence, though, in their consciousness.
I mean, they're less smart for sure.
Okay, less smart. Interesting. Okay, the last two animals that I wanted to talk about were pigs and cattle.
Okay.
Briefly, how do you think about these two and whether or not they're conscious and capable of suffering? And maybe, I know this is kind of rehashing some of the things that we have already said, but I'd like to hear it, I guess, more explicitly shared into them.
I would say I'm like 99% sure that they're capable of experience and suffering, and they have consciousness of their own type. They have experience in the sense that we mean it. They have brains very similar to ours. They have structures and attention control mechanisms and self-models and so on. Yeah, of course. I would say for sure. I suspect pigs are smarter creatures than cows. I think they're supposed to be super smart. Much smarter than dogs, for example. Yes. And, we eat them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't, but other people do. People are carnivores, and the world is brutal. What can I say?
Yeah, people are carnivores, but they don't eat other people.
That's true. At least most of the time.
Most people don't, yeah.
There are cultures where was a common accepted occurrence.
Michael, this has been, for me, one of the much more... I don't know, you question the role that science should play in people's dietary decisions, but for me, not only is the consciousness subject extremely fascinating, but this conversation has been extremely useful for me in how I think about my life, and I'm sure it will be for many of our listeners too. So thank you again so much for sitting down and having me in your office at Princeton and talking about this. It's been lovely.
Sure, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. I think that's such an interesting slant on it, essentially, consciousness from the point of view of diet.